These days in the NHL, we are once again seeing more and more players have 40, 50, 60 goal and 100 plus point seasons.
Goaltenders don't love it. I love the scoring sub.
Yeah, it's great.
More goals, the better.
And when offensive, generational talents prove themselves as such in the NHL and put up a lot of goals or points, they start a lot of discussions. How has the league made offense easier or harder to come by? Were players before them better? Are the 80s numbers coming back? But let's not argue semantics, let's look at the facts and examine errors and trends as a whole instead of mindlessly comparing individuals or dramatizing common sense. I'm not just here to say hockey players, equipment technology, and training is good and surprise getting better, so offense, goals, video done. I'm here to examine what many people are calling the return of the golden era of hockey, claiming that the high-scoring era of the 1980s is back or on the verge of it. So let's take a look at what the numbers say, what history tells us, why people are making these claims, why NHL scoring was so high in the 80s to begin with, what has caused increases in goal scoring over the years, and if this current era actually signifies the return of 1980s goal scoring. Higher scoring games don't just pop out of the blue. Players don't just go, alright men, let's score, but like a lot now. Like everything else, evolution causes the change. There have been all kinds of changes made to the sport that had an impact on scoring, which built the foundation of the modern game and led to the high-scoring 80s. Even though the game we see today is a product of drastic improvements, for many, the peak was the 1980s, mainly because it was such a high-scoring era. Yes, there were great players, but goals were simply easier to come by. Here's the number of 40 and 50 goal scorers every year from the 1979-80 to the 2023-2024 season, with the half seasons removed. Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux were head and shoulders above any other player during their primes. They were often worth at least 2 star players. But they played in an overall high-scoring league to rack up those stats. And even today, the high-end players are what's driving these return of the 80s arguments. And while we are seeing players put up big numbers again, individuals racking up high totals doesn't inherently mean league-wide scoring is up that drastically. So before we get into the weeds, let's take a look at the league averages through the years and see if this truly is the return of 1980s-like goal-scoring numbers or not. And as we can see, well, it is sort of going up a bit in recent years. No matter how much some fans and the league themselves want to advertise an increase in goal scoring, it's nowhere near the 80s, where scoring hit highs not seen since the 1940s. But there has been an increase since the dead puck era, where scoring hit lows not seen since the 1950s, and a slight increase from the 2010s, where scoring was also consistently low. This doesn't mean NHL offense isn't entertaining, but it does mean this isn't the 80s. And real quick, why was scoring so high in the earliest days of the NHL? Well, mainly a complete imbalance in offense and defense. Most teams only cared about offense, and of course it was borderline impossible to be a goalie. Historically, there haven't been many rules introduced to hamper goal scoring, but of course scoring didn't just go up and up and up. As with every change that resulted in more goals, teams adapted their strategies and defense, and slowly things dropped off again. The league obviously still has standout offensive players, but scoring in today's game comes with its own unique hurdles, just like the 80s had. Both mainly derived from major changes to the rules, the league, and the sport itself. And the evolution of today's scoring increases do have some parallels with the changes the game saw in the past that increased scoring, though again, in many ways it can be seen as a completely different game these days. So let's go back to the 1980s. What exactly happened? First, let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. Equipment played a big part. Aluminum stick shafts exploded in popularity in the 80s, which came with never-before-seen durability. Look up any video where today's sticks broke at unfortunate moments, and you'll often see what I can only assume are very old people filling the comments with something like, "That's why they should still be using wood," or "This wouldn't happen with wood sticks." Listen, wood sticks may not have broken from taking a pass very often or twice in one shift from shooting, but they did bend in all kinds of inconsistent areas of the stick, sometimes turning into a noodle by the blade, other times 6 inches above the blade, even if they were the same stick, made by the same manufacturer at the same time. With the increase in durability and stiffness that aluminum sticks allowed, also came an increase in shot accuracy. Along with that, aluminum sticks were, for the most part, much lighter than wood, allowing for much quicker stick handling. All of this favored particularly offensive players quite a bit. Gretzky himself essentially put the nail in the wooden coffin when he made the switch to aluminum shafts. Today's stick improvements haven't taken place as rapidly or dramatically, but they are happening. The one-piece composite sticks used now have improved in similar ways and are constantly getting lighter and lighter. Though they sacrifice some durability that aluminum had, opting for enhanced performance instead, they're still extremely durable for the force they endure. Like wood sticks, today's players are using sticks with a ton of flex, but the difference is the flex happens in consistent areas of the stick, enabling familiar technique and feel in general with every new stick you grab off the bench. But most of the time, they also remain stiff and and durable enough to stick handle and hack other sticks very hard, while giving you the ability to shoot far and away the hardest and most accurate wrist shots of all time. And not only that, but you can shoot said wrist shots with your hands incredibly close together, which means you barely have to change your hand position for shooting from your stick handling hand position, which means it's harder than ever to tell exactly when a shot is coming for defenders and goalies.
What about your hand position? I know some of us who were not quite as strong as you, we had to get our hand pretty far down the stick to bend it.
I like stick handle and shoot from kind of up here, but
Skating itself has gone through an underrated improvement as well, and unless you're Ovechkin on the power play, you have to skate to score. Edge work has never been better, and skates themselves play a huge role. They've gotten lighter, stiffer, and more durable. You're not carrying around weights on your feet, your ankles won't explode with every shot you block, and simply pushing off a firm yet comfortable surface allows for sharper stops or direction changes. And of course a more powerful stride instead of wasting energy battling the more pliant skates of old. The molded plastic boot concept was introduced in the 70s, but companies like Bauer made massive strides with them in, guess what, the 80s. Go figure. And of course, every behind-the-scenes aspect of the game is taken more seriously as the years go on. Having tactics evolve, having specific trainers, having their knowledge evolve, having players who are willing and able to commit to training and nutritional regimens that benefit their athletic ability. It all plays a massive role. Even with the basic common sense stuff, like cocaine use being less common than it once was, and players not smoking cigarettes between periods anymore. Technique and etiquette are constantly improving in all areas. They improved drastically from the 70s to 80s, and they're improving now. Only now, while not every player obviously follows the same training and routines or uses the same equipment, the playing field is better and more level than it's ever been. And a more even playing field means less vastly inferior opponents that are there to be taken advantage of. But advancement in training and technology isn't everything, so what else happened outside of player equipment and intangibles back then that set the league up for that rampant increase in goal scoring? Well, first, the league expanded drastically. It doesn't matter how good players and equipment get, the more you expand the league, the less best on best talent you have. Plain and simple. Yes, there are plenty of players who aren't in the league and wouldn't look totally out of place if they were. But if you were to delete 2 teams, you wouldn't just delete the Kraken and Golden Knights. Instead, you'd end up getting rid of 40 plus of the league's worst players and leave a higher quality of competition game to game all around. So of course, expansion can explain a lot of the 1980s scoring increase. 4 teams joined the league in the 1979-80 season, and most of them were in rough shape for their entire short-lived existence. Only one of those original franchises remains, and the 3 others relocated within 3 years of each other. And yes, that expansion draft brought in some of the best players to ever play the game, along with the first real wave of European players thanks to some WHL pickups, but that expansion brought far more subpar players by NHL standards, and the best players feasted on them.
The Winnipeg Jets set an NHL record they would just as soon forget about: 30 games without a win.
The recent expansion rules have allowed teams to protect 8 skaters and a goalie, or 10 skaters and a goalie, depending on combination of positions from being taken by new teams, while everyone else was left up for grabs for one new team to pick from, and that one team ended up instantly making the Cup final in Vegas's case. But in the 1979-80 expansion, teams were allowed to protect 15 skaters and a goalie, and there was 4 new teams to scavenge from the remains along with some WHL picks and outside hires. And they only had 17 teams to pick players from, so it was tough to build a competent team to say the least. Management was also a very different game back then. Basic economics obviously still play a role. You have to manage your money properly and have owners that are willing to spend their money, but budgets played a very different yet even more significant role back then. It's worth noting that pay inequality could be even more strategic or play a bigger role in building a good team in the late 70s and 80s than it does now, as particularly wealthy owners and less educated teams in general sort of trump the salary cap hurdles of today in many ways. So you could stack up on star players as much as you wanted or could afford and leave the rest of the league with less talent to go around. And the league wasn't as cautious with who they would allow to own teams in general, whether or not they had the money or willingness to use it in order to win. So there were mismatches everywhere, which again helped stacked teams and star players take advantage of subpar ones. Even in the 80s, many players had multiple jobs throughout the year. Minimum salary was around $20,000 to $25,000 in the 70s and 80s. However, NHL hockey still wasn't a year-round job for many NHL players, for financial reasons or because it wasn't an absolute necessity to remain competitive yet. But more importantly, it certainly wasn't a full-time job for any replacement players, as most of the time, if you're a farm team player coming up, you only make NHL minimums when you're in the NHL. The league approved the operation of farm teams back in the 1930s, where only the Rangers, Americans, Falcons, and Bruins had access to them. But the formal system of farm team affiliations expanded and became more established from the 1970s and on, and of course, their salaries were nothing close to the NHL. Certainly certainly not enough to play hockey full-time. Now, in 2024, current AHL minimum salary is $52,725 US, so a pretty steep fall-off from the NHL minimum, but it is enough to solely play professional hockey for a living. Along with the fact that the vast majority of pro players come from wealthy families, especially compared to previous generations, so most of these players aren't going to be out on the streets even with poor money management. But again, that just wasn't the case back in the day. So, unless you were an established, wealthy, far above average team like the Canadiens, you probably had plenty of players who weren't even playing hockey full-time. So back then, you had players who were on pace to make $25,000 for the few games that they played, playing against the Montreal Canadiens, whose lowest paid players made $55,000, which was almost a third of their highest paid players making $180,000. Again, meaning the best teams and players were mercy-killing guys who were already less talented, but who also had to work 2 jobs. It's safe to say that all NHL players can concentrate solely on hockey these days, even if they're just relatively smart with their finances, whether they're the lowest or highest paid on the team. But sure enough, look what's come with modern expansion regardless. More goals per game. And it's obviously easier to be a better team out of the gate now, as you're not just set up for instant failure. So the best players don't get to murder teams full of minor league players half a dozen times a season. But still, talent gets diluted across the league with expansion no matter how you slice it, and the best players and teams will always take advantage of it. Another major way the game has changed is penalties. A huge misconception is that more penalties are being called these days than in prior seasons, and that's why scoring has gone up recently, which is the opposite of what's happened. And that's also had a big impact on home ice advantage, where teams used to rack up goals far more than on the road. Check out my video on the decline of home ice advantage if you'd like. Now, there are less penalties called and power plays given than just about ever. Yes, there's less blatant obstruction like slashes and hooks that weren't being called. One, because refs are held to a higher standard. Believe it or not, refs have been much, much worse than they are now. And 2, because players would be sitting on the bench for taking those stupid penalties and costing their teams these days, so they don't make those plays. So, less power play goals, despite slightly increasing power play percentages in recent years. Though percentages aren't as high as the 80s, as the 80s saw some of the most power play opportunities per game and highest power play percentages the league has ever seen. Something that really helped get those percentages up was just how important staying at even strength was, because the technique and equipment of skaters was evolving much faster than goalies. Like everyone else on the ice, these days goalies are literally, not hypothetically, all things considered, better than they've ever been. They are very hard to score on. You could argue, however, that offensive players and skater equipment in general are evolving faster than goalies yet again. But the difference is negligible compared to what it once was. In the 80s, there wasn't a single year where average save percentages were above .890. Today, that is considered absolutely brutal and is often cause to get your ice time cut. Goaltending was terrible back then. It's legitimately hard to take highlights or games from the past in general very seriously when you see the atrocious technique and equipment that goalies had. That's the main reason why kids today will be flabbergasted and underwhelmed with even the great ones' highlight reels. Also, everyone now knows that having all the skills, along with size, makes a world of difference in net. Most teams hadn't arrived at that train of thought in the 80s. Many goalies were still small people back then, something we don't see today at all. Around 100 goalies played throughout the 80s who were smaller than the smallest goalie in today's league by a long shot. Most of them at heights we haven't seen a single NHL goalie at in over 20 years. And sure enough, while there is evidence of the butterfly as far back as Glenn Hall in the 50s, it wasn't commonplace or whatsoever modernized until the mid-80s, early 90s, and of course has gone through massive improvements. A big reason good technique by today's standards wasn't popular with many goalies was how heavy goalie pads got throughout the game from soaking up water.
The only problem for the goalies now is their equipment getting heavy. Just from the ice getting up and down in the snow, they start to take on weight.
A problem today's goalies don't have. And when the ability to easily utilize that technique became commonplace, it changed the game, along with gargantuan equipment that lasted well into the 2000s, which of course led to a decrease in goal scoring. And of course, helping goalies ease into their new techniques and equipment in the 90s and early 2000s was the dead puck era, the relentlessly exploited and exceptionally boring neutral zone traps.
The Devils have their trap working great. They have eaten up the Rangers so many times in the last 5 minutes.
We knew that we had to keep it close. The longer the game went, the closer it was, the better chance we had to win.
Ready to get back, ready to get back.
Everyone hung back, played defense, and forced opponents to the outside, while waiting to counterattack sometimes. And the traps were popularized in large part by weaker on-paper teams due to, that's right, lopsided expansion.
The Panthers used Roger Nielsen's choking neutral zone defense to smother the Canadiens' attack.
You know, and it just led to the attitude that every game we play, we can win.
And we still see those exact traps even today, often utilized by yet again weaker teams, or teams defending leads. But since the game is so much faster, it's often far less effective than in the 90s and early 2000s, when it was incredibly boring no matter how people try to reframe the era by highlighting its star players, who simply prospered in a restricted, boring league and had much of their legacy diminished and now written off as a result. While I wholeheartedly disagree with Gary Bettman on many things, mainly concussions and ads, I completely agree that changes had to be made, and I commend him and the league for making them. It was awful stuff to watch, it killed goal scoring, and it was killing the sport, which forced the NHL's hand to bring back more goal scoring.
We had teams with $80 and $90 million payrolls, and we had teams with $20 million payrolls.
So in 2005, the league stepped in a big way. First and foremost, one of the reasons the salary cap was added was to level the playing field.
And I would talk to the managers and the coaches of the $20 million teams, and I go, how are you doing this? And they would say to me, to a man, we clutch, we grab, we hook, we hold, and we do everything possible to neutralize skill for 50 minutes, and then we try and steal the game.
They got rid of the two-line pass rule, so players could now pass the puck across the blue lines and center ice line to stretch out and get behind the defense.
First period, puck sent all the way down to Sandstrom. He gets a shot and a save, but a two-line pass going to be called here.
They made it so teams were no longer allowed line changes after icing the puck. They reduced the size of goalie equipment, something they've continued to tinker with in relatively drastic ways as recently as 2017. They added the trapezoid behind the net, making that the only place that goalies could now play the puck behind the net to discourage dump-ins, as prior to the trapezoid, goalies could rush to the corner, cut the puck off early, and break out.
They put a rule in for him, let's face it. The trapezoid is put in because of Marty Brodeur.
Now they'd have to wait for the puck to come behind the net, which means more time for forecheckers to get into the zone, to apply pressure or to cut off passes. And since goalies now have less time, it's not only much harder to play the puck, but you end up with goalies in more sticky situations, which results in some funky goals.
Fires it in. Price knocks it down. He's so good at that, just routine. And then he turns it over, he gets caught!
They brought back tagging up instead of automatic offsides.
National zone, Rene waiting for it. Leaves it there for Ekholm. Delayed offside being called against Chicago.
The goal line was pushed back towards the end boards, and the blue lines were pushed up towards center ice, increasing the size of the offensive zone and reducing the size of the neutral zone, in theory making it harder to use the neutral zone trap. Referees were made to crack down on obstruction penalties for more than the first month of the season, so less successful traps and more power plays. And they added the shootout, instead of ending games in ties. Of course, shootout goals have never counted towards goal totals, but they did give the appearance of offense and guaranteed at least some offensive entertainment to even the lowest scoring games. Then around 2010, the league started cracking down on headshots. It took quite a while to do that. So did implementing mandatory helmets for new players, which did its fair share of preserving careers as well. And that rule was introduced in the 1979-80 season.
Well, we're finally at my favorite part, body checking, right, Kevin? Checking? Chris, you have a tough enough time checking your luggage.
At the line, whoa, he hit. Gretzky really belted by McCreary, and he is hurt.
I don't like airplanes anyway.
While there's still a problem, and always will be, players don't have to worry about getting absolutely brutal concussions as much as they once did via head contact, which means more freedom to play and longer careers for players who have the puck a lot. Then in 2013, they also got rid of touch icing for the same reason, to prevent injury and prolong careers.
A lot of people say, oh, well, you don't understand how players get hurt on these types of plays. Well, there's your video evidence.
Most of those at least somewhat worked.
And that is why the game as it was being played in the late 90s and early 2000s wasn't nearly as good as it is today.
Yet, despite those rule changes, along with skater and equipment evolution, as we've seen, scoring has still never reached the heights of the past and is still relatively low in comparison to most eras of the NHL. So why is this the case, other than goalies also getting drastically better? Well, it's also much less risky to block shots than it once was when equipment didn't really absorb much impact whatsoever. So shot blocking is now seen as being expected from everyone, rather than some unique sacrifice. And of course, the beloved coach's challenge. Sure, some goals are only scored because of challenges, but they are few and far between in comparison to goals that are taken away. In the past 3 seasons alone, there have been 180 goals taken away and only 5 awarded as a result of a challenge. So those have obviously reduced scoring and would have resulted in many goals being taken off the board throughout history before the challenges were implemented. However, scoring isn't going down these days despite the challenges. These 80s comparisons aren't made for no reason, so why has it been trending slightly upward at least in very recent seasons? Well, defensemen are evolving. evolving. But the thing is, the position is evolving away from defense. While the strictly offensive defensemen, who are like having a fourth forward out there, are definitely getting phased out of the game, so are the stay-at-home defensemen, who prevented many goals. Now they have to do both to stay in the league, but the newfound middle ground for ideal D-men does tend to lean more towards the offensive D of old than the defensive ones. You have to be a very good skater now, instead of some massive guy who protects the house strictly by force. The best thing you can do for your defense partner is be an option, and you're only an option if you're in the right position. Staggering yourself behind the invisible horizontal line between you and your partner in the neutral and defensive zone is one of the most important things you can do as a defenseman. But since just about every player has so much hockey sense and is so fast, you also have to be a reliable outlet who's able to make plays in the offensive zone all the way back to behind your net, so you can't simply favor one zone as much anymore. And forwards now instinctively head for the open space to be an option while simultaneously covering for defensemen very quickly, rather than doing it in slow reactionary fashion. Speaking of players who were in the game strictly as a physical force, there are less and less enforcers, or people who aren't in the NHL because of hockey skills, but mainly to fight, as there once was. Today's lineups often feature 4 full lines who are capable of scoring goals, rather than relying on 2 or 3 to do all the scoring. So obviously, the more offensively gifted players that play, the more goals there are. And enforcers heavily being phased out of the game is still a relatively recent thing. It's also worth noting that as of the 2020-2021 season, players no longer had to be in contact with the blue line in order to be considered onside, which has meant less offsides and less delayed zone entry for those without the puck, and potentially more goals. And of course, maybe the main cause of goal scoring increasing over the last little while is overtime. Shootouts became hated by many and perhaps most fans pretty soon after they were introduced. So right after the league brought them in, they listened to the fans and added an overtime period 10 years later. 3-on-3 overtime was introduced in 2015, which literally adds more scoring rather than the perception of it. Especially lately, since 3-on-3 strategy has had time to improve, with possession being valued above blind, no-holds-barred end-to-end rushes. 3-on-3 overtimes resulted in 1,612 goals from the 2015-16 to the 2023-2024 season, which means they've replaced equally as many shootouts or ties and counting. So in the end, again, no, this isn't the 80s, but is 80s level scoring coming back? Well, unless goaltending takes an absolute nosedive and the league goes through massive expansion like we saw in the 80s, or if the league makes some new wacky rules to hamper defense, or if $800,000 a year becomes no longer enough to work only one job, no, it's probably not coming back. Wayne Gretzky and high-scoring players from the 80s were in the unique positions to play in one of the most offensively lopsided eras of all time by being on the forefront and utilizing some of the most substantial innovations in technology the game has ever seen, by taking advantage of the changes the league made, and by destroying the last generation of the worst goaltending technique the sport will ever see. Gretzky himself will humbly tell you that he played in the right era to excel.
The era I played in was the right era where a little bit more wide open European, Russian style of game. Came in at the right time, the right team, the right coach.
And despite lower goal scoring, we are watching the best the sport has ever been from a talent standpoint. People can argue that intangible aspects like worse refereeing or headshots made the game better, but what's indisputable is if you transported a 3rd or 4th line player from today exactly as they are, with the equipment and training that they get to utilize, straight back to the 80s, if they could have stayed healthy despite being assaulted, they'd be considered an elite, never-before-seen, godlike goal-scoring Hall of Famer. The NHL record books are lined with players from eras that were heavily tilted in favor of offense. Since things have evened out and scoring has gone significantly down since then, I'd say what Alexander Ovechkin and the game's other great offensive players have done over these past couple decades, against the quality of teams and goalies that they faced, is nothing short of miraculous. In the comments, if there's any league changes that you haven't enjoyed, what's something you'd like to see reversed? What do you think the NHL will do next in an effort to increase goal scoring? And what would you do if you were in their shoes, if anything? A switch to European ice surface sizes, perhaps. As for the future, of course there are natural things that could result in more or less goals depending on how well they're utilized, through practice, technology, or stats in either direction. Skill, coaching, video study, and stat analysis can be utilized or exposed. From general offensive and defensive concepts to players and coaches figuring out the tendencies of goalies, or goalies figuring out the tendencies of skaters. For now, I'd expect scoring to continue to rise, as the league is still hot on the heels of expansion, and with more new teams potentially on the horizon.
If there is, in fact, genuine interest from Houston, we might be in a position to take a look at it.
Today's averages may soon be blown out of the water. Regardless, it'll be interesting to see what happens next. But one thing is for sure, the league will always be after an increase in goal scoring, and they'll always attempt to make the current age the golden age in someone's eyes.
Okay, I'll be Wayne Gretzky. You be the goalie. Try keeping the puck out of the net for a change.